Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Geoff McMurchy. I was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta. Grew up there, stayed until I was 17, I guess, at which point I moved to Vancouver. I thought, with no big plan to stay there, actually I went for the summer, had some money in my pocket, and just went, was encouraged by a friend to come and live in a communal house, and ended up staying. And so I was just about 18 at that point, in the fall of, what year would that be? 73. Can I take a minute to?
Yeah, that's okay. So what year were you born? Sorry, because I...
55.
Okay. Willie, what year? Let's do the math. No, don't worry about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I would have turned 18 in 73.
Okay.
Okay. I just had to sort of figure that out. So, and I attended art school in Vancouver, the Emily Carr, then the Emily Carr College of Art, now the Vancouver, or the, no, it was called the Vancouver School of Art, now the Emily Carr Institute. And it was, I guess, around, it was sometime between, probably in around 74 or 5 actually, that I first came into contact, because I had friends who worked there. One, Charlene Gardner, was a residence coordinator there, and Arthur Giovinazzo was the office coordinator there for a time. So yeah, it was early on.
And you just met those people socially?
Yes, yeah. They were from Alberta. I can't remember how I actually met them all, but they were kind of the Lethbridge gang in my mind, known as such. And yeah, it was just a social thing. So I just, in that way, came to hang out at the drop-in center a little bit, and was really impressed by this incredibly vibrant organization that was just, living this this idea of participatory democracy with all its pros and cons. So I guess we can get into some of those a little bit later. But so I hadn't been I wasn't. My focus was artistic pursuits, really, in my personal life. I guess it was just something about my upbringing that predisposed me to I don't know, empathize or be attracted to groups that were working for social justice. And as it turns out, there was good reason for me to get involved with it, and I later broke my neck and became part of the disability rights movement.
Were you involved in any other group? Like, I think it's interesting that you encountered MPA and you were attracted, and I'm just wondering, were you like involved in, say, Greenpeace or
No.
So it was just MPA?
Nothing really, yeah. And I had two, and I was interested enough and excited enough by the concept that I ended up working there as a drop-in coordinator at the drop-in center on U Street for, that's where my memory fails me. I don't remember how long exactly, a couple of years anyways. And then made plans to go to art school in Nova Scotia, left in '77. Broke my neck on the way, and MPA, to their credit, decided to renovate a little bachelor suite in the building where the drop-in center was, still at that point on U Street. And so when I came back from doing rehab, which was about 7 months, I actually moved in next door to the drop-in and then continued to work as a drop-in coordinator. Sorry, no, not as drop-in, as a residence coordinator at the one on McDonald. I guess that would be the West 7th residence. That 7th McDonald, I think. So yeah, so at that point I was really immersed in MPA, living right next door, and my bachelor apartment, fronted on the sidewalk. So it was a bit of an immersion, with some of the goings on that happened on the sidewalk outside the drop-in, and then working at the residence. And there were a couple of members that helped. I was fresh out of rehab, a quad, didn't have a motorized chair, so getting to and from was a challenge. But there were a couple of members that stepped up and helped me get to and from the residence, to supplement my co-residence coordinator who did have a car. So it all worked out, and and I think actually we didn't end up even building a wheelchair ramp at the thing. The residents just hauled me up and down the stairs on a daily basis. But it all worked out, and I'm really grateful to MPA for making those accommodations. And
I had no idea. See, this is the faultiness of research. Because that puts you, you were involved earlier than I thought.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that you were like a housing, like a residence coordinator.
Yeah.
And that piece about when you came back after rehab, that's it's a very meaningful thing for an organization to do.
Yeah, it was incredible. It just happened to have this space that wasn't really being used. I guess it had been. I'm not even sure what it had been used for, or to what extent they had to renovate it. I guess there must have been plumbing. Maybe it was a little apartment before and it just became vacant. I don't really recall. But I know there were renovations because I actually had to wait for a month or two after I arrived back, and actually stayed with Arthur upstairs from the drop-in. He had an apartment upstairs, and stayed with him until the place was ready.
Because that was early days too for accommodations for people with disabilities.
Yeah, the cooperative housing movement hadn't really flourished at that point. So yeah, it would have been tough to find a place an adequate place to stay.
So who were the kind of movers and shakers in MPA when you were involved then?
Well, it seemed like, I was well aware that Lanny, back when it started things, he was I got the impression he was kind of a recluse, and I remember seeing him a few times, but he wasn't much involved by the time I came along.
Yeah.
Saw a certain amount more of Harry Cool. He was around. Jackie, whose last name
Hooper?
Hooper was kind of involved. As I said, my friend Arthur was office coordinator, so he was really integrally involved.
Yeah, I tried to find him, but I only got as far as Whitehorse with him.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Well, I could probably help with that.
Well, that would be great, because he looked interesting, that's all. He just looked interesting, and I couldn't track him down any further. And was Fran Phillips involved when you were on? Does that a name ring any bells for you?
I remember the name. I can kind of see her, but was she a residence coordinator?
I would have, it's really hard for me to just access.
Yeah,
But she was one
I
of the-
recognize the name.
She seems to have been a long-term, was she a former nurse? Yeah. Yeah, she's an interesting person because she's a professional that comes into the MPA, but she's unfortunately no longer alive, so we can't.
Another person I remember who kind of was spearheading a newer program within the court system was Marilyn Sargi. She was really actively involved, and she would be another sort of
She was-
professional. Kind
Yeah,
of
she was busy this past week when we were in Vancouver, but I'm hoping that the Vancouver group will be able to interview her at some point, because she sounded, because that's something that we haven't heard enough about. We haven't interviewed anyone that was involved in that court workers program.
Yeah. So those are the names I remember most. Gord. I was thinking of somebody else who was a photographer and seemed to be. It's sort of hard to define when you say movers and shakers, because it was a fairly
Egalitarian.
horizontal.
Right.
Right.
Even at
Figures.
that point, you would still. Was that still the case in the early '80s? Because you were involved then for quite an interesting period in the evolution of the
Yeah, I would say
organization.
in the mid-70s when it was first exposed, it was much more egalitarian. It sort of got eroded by, funding requirements and whatever else. And the sheer size of the organization is just, as great as democracy is, it's a little bit tedious to make, virtually all the decisions with so many people involved. But I remember, like, earlier on when I was first exposed, those meetings would go on forever, and a lot of decisions would get hashed through, and it was in fact quite egalitarian. But as I say, it sort of became less so as the organization grew. What was I answering? I just derailed. What was I?
Well, I was trying to get at changes, and because I get the sense that by the late '80s, funding regulations had got tighter. As you say, the organization was phenomenally successful. In terms of like its real estate holdings and the different programs that it was running. It was really, really successful, and you're right, success creates its own structures. And then I was trying to remember, but I think it was after you were involved, but when, I'm trying to remember when staff unionized at MPA.
Yeah, that was way after me.
That was after you, yeah, because I gather that was a very profound change, because at that point, the staff wasn't elected. So when you were there, the staff was still elected at that point?
Yeah, it was, the members of each residence elected who they wanted to be their coordinators, or two per house. And the drop-in coordinators were elected by the general membership. So in some ways, it could be perceived as a popularity contest, really. People weren't required to have any credentials, and provided that they, hung out enough and got to know enough people and were liked, they could potentially have a job there. So, there's nothing, not to say that, to typify it as popularity contest, not to denigrate it. I mean, that's basically democracy at work. I'm just trying to think the reason that I was really drawn to the organization, apart from, because as I say, I wasn't that politically involved with other groups, or, I mean, I had a kind of a natural affinity for equality work, I think. But a lot of, part of what, or at least part of what attracted me to MPA was the individual characters and the creativity, the degree of creativity that coexisted with people's craziness. It just, I just find it really fascinating, the other realities that people experience, and the other other quote unquote perspectives that come out of that. I remember there was a character. Has anybody mentioned Gerald Buddha to you? He was quite an intense guy. He'd been apprehended a number of times for breaking windows. He had this whole mythology of his own around why he needed to break windows, and I can't remember what that was, but on this, it sticks in my memory that there was a poetry contest at a certain time, and people were supposed to submit a poem, ahead of time and by a certain deadline, and then they would all be judged at a certain meeting. And Gerald hadn't submitted anything, but he just stood up at the meeting and recited this incredible poem, and won the contest. And there were just a lot of instances like that of this amazing intelligence and creativity that just came from another place than what's considered normal. That really fascinates me, and part of what kept me hanging around.
And it's not, I mean, what is really neat about what you just said is that, to me, I think, well, that's not most people's perception of mental illness today, right? But that's what you saw at MPA.
And what I've subsequently, grown into doing with my life, basically, is because I'm now artistic director of a disability arts organization. So, I just see that as, that was really interesting that I ended up doing that with MPA, and that was sort of my interest. And then that's, in my own life, it's kind of flourished. I'd be interested to go back and hang out a little bit at MPA and see what's going on there, and if they have, I don't know if they have any arts programs or outlets for people, that are institutionalized, or if it's just an individual thing.
Well, they have that. Willie was filming at the drop-in.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's a different crowd, though Lanny describes it as a very diverse crowd at the drop-in.
I remember they did try to facilitate things. There was a guy, I think they had some darkroom equipment at the drop-in that was used, on occasion. Somebody donated a sewing machine. I guess this was when I was a drop-in coordinator, so I started these classes to teach people how to make just basic drawstring pants. And there was an art room. I don't remember where supplies were kept or what actually, if a lot happened in there, but there were some attempts to provide people with creative outlets. But whether there were or not, they were just, the people had this, or some of the people, I should say, had just this amazing innate creativity that just came out. And as I say, I'm just fascinated by the relationship between that and people's mental illness.
Yeah, so you were attracted by the egalitarian or the social, I guess, social justice piece of it,
Mhm.
but then also by that connection between madness and creativity.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so because you were an artist, that would speak to you.
Mhm, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So, but you didn't function as an artist in that environment, except in small ways of encouraging and appreciating creativity.
Yeah, not really. Well, just in, helping lay out the newsletter in a nutshell and the publication head on. But no, not as in any other way as an artist.
So, do you want to? I referred to the kind of clientele, and you've referred to that too. But Lanny talked about how diverse the kinds of people were who were hanging out at MPA, and I find it interesting that you, as new to Vancouver, somebody without any connection with the mental health system, or just not that, is attracted to, because you wouldn't probably go to a similar drop-in today, or maybe you would, but I don't know that, like, it seems that MPA was a particular kind of milieu in that moment too.
Well, yeah, it was a really incredibly diverse bunch of people. I remember this guy named Owen who had a philosophy degree, really quiet guy, would just, sit around reading and chatting with people. And he was older at that point, even, and so there were and he was one of the people I would call a regular, and there were quite a few people who would come daily. I guess coffee was a big attraction, and just having someplace sheltered and that had hot coffee was, and the TV room. But yeah, broad cross section of ages, and I'm tempted to say there were more males hanging out than females, but that may not be. That may just be my impression. And pretty diverse racially. Some Aboriginal folks that I can remember, and Owen, the guy I mentioned, was a black man. So yeah, and from the full range of people that who would be acting out, quote unquote, on a regular basis, to people that were just very quiet and would sit on the couch most of the time. Diverse bunch of people, and the fact that they could manage to, especially in the early days, make decisions together was pretty amazing. And I don't really know. I mean, you wouldn't expect that to work, and probably a lot of people didn't. And I'm not sure what to attribute its success to, because it really was very successful from starting with whatever it was, 75 people or something, congregating, to drop into what must be now a multi-million-dollar concern with an apartment building and numerous residences. It's how that worked is I guess part of what you're trying to figure out.
Well, yeah, I find it very fascinating because it's so diverse, and like I said, these people who aren't survivor consumers, whatever you call them, coming in just because it was an interesting place.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't know what attracted a lot of other people to it. I mean, I remember even at the time that I was because it was after I broke my neck and was working as a residence coordinator. My family happened to be in town visiting, and my little sister, who was like 10 years old, was all excited, and she wanted to work at MPA too when she grew up. So there's something, you know, inherently exciting and vibrant about this organization. And, it's hard to put your finger on it. I guess, you know, MPA's goals, when it started out, kind of dovetailed with government programs around deinstitutionalization. So that was, you know, the timing was right to be making efforts to find creative solutions for housing people, at least. So, you know, the government was inclined to support those efforts. But the fact that they gave, you know, that much control and resources over to a bunch of crazy people is it's great.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the early funding, Willie, are we picking up noise from outside?
Yeah, I'll just call this.
Okay. And I think part of the early funding came from those LIP grants, those local initiative project grants, and then they were really good at getting funding. Like Lanny I've read some of his grant applications. He was really smart.
Yeah.
He was really good at getting funding, and but I think you're right. There was a need because people were living in the community, and then it fits with other things that are emerging, ideas about you know community-based organizations, whole kinds of like LIP grants. Apparently started the first crisis center in Vancouver, and you know, I know that they helped start midwifery, and, you know, so alternatives, like different ways of perceiving things. But it is amazing that a bunch of crazy people managed to get that funding from the government. Yeah, yeah. But I think they were also well connected, and you know, marshaled their resources, and they had the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, right, to help buy those houses. Yeah, so the funding's an important part. So how much did you get paid? Like, was it you got paid for being drop-in coordinator?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember at all what. It wasn't great pay, but it was enough to survive on.
Right, right. And a residence coordinator would also be a paid position,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And they were probably paid the same. I don't, as I say, I don't recall what that was, but yeah, it was enough. I can remember. I mean, I did that for a couple of years at least. Because it was probably 79. Well, yeah, a couple of years anyways. Might have been until 82 or so, when I got involved with another organization, BC Coalition of People with Disabilities.
Right, so you sort of shifted your focus to where your life was at.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So how would you describe the politics of the organization when you were involved?
The which?
The kind of politics, like would you have described it as anti-psychiatry?
Well, I think the overriding sentiment probably was more anti-psychiatry, but maybe officially it was just choice for people to, you know, self-define and self-determine whether they needed or wanted drugs. But I think there was fairly strong anti-psychiatric sentiment among probably the majority of people.
Because you start, you know, the heading to the 80s starts off with a long Thomas Sass quote, and I mean, were those ideas and Artie Lang ideas of madness as
Social construct.
yeah, social construct?
Yeah, I think those were fairly. A lot of people were fairly influenced by those sentiments. I'm not sure how much how much I was paying attention to the politics, and I guess that's or to whether or not people's diagnoses were relevant. I guess that's a statement on on the anti-psychiatric in concert with the anti-psychiatric camp. Because I recognize that there are, in the same way that physical disabilities are, what's disabling often is more society's perception than the disability itself. I think that is true of psychiatric disabilities too.
Sorry, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
And yeah, and just that, although, there are people who find that the drugs help, and that, so no, I guess I'm just, of the pro-choice, people have to follow their own paths and figure it out for themselves. I think even where drugs help, though, they're so often over prescribed that, and there really is a tendency in the medical profession to obviously to rely too much on medications. That people need to be educated. I mean, there's real need for a balance of information around alternatives that might be available, might be useful. Because I think that nutrition and such really plays a huge role. So it's a matter of figuring that out.
Yeah.
For the individual self.
I from the interviews that we've done, it seems like that Lanny and Stan Persky and perhaps Barry Cool are coming. Yeah, I think Barry Cool would have been coming from quite a robust kind of leftist perspective, but that there's sort of all these counterculture messages, which probably where that notion of choice kind of comes from. But some of the people we interviewed, like Dave Beamish, said, "Oh, I really wasn't in the same political camp as those guys at all." But nonetheless, he considered MPA his organization too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think for you to sort of say, well, you didn't kind of like come at it from that, is entirely in keeping with the milieu of the MPA, in that it was pretty accommodating to a range of perspectives. Mm-hmm. Probably not particularly accommodating to a pro-psychiatry perspective, but to a choice perspective, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there were certain rules that were established, were pretty basic. No violence and no alcohol, and there were not very many rules. And if people were, there was a real effort to handle, if people started to transgress those lines and be a problem, or be making too much noise or bothering people or whatever, there was a real effort to handle that, on a one-to-one or basis, or internally, I mean, without just automatically calling the police or shipping people off to wherever. So it was, there was a really strong ethic of meeting people where they are and trying to accommodate their situations, and regardless of, where they stood on the meds situation, or the meds question.
Did
That
you-
made sense.
Did you get any training?
No. No.
So you just started hanging out and then just started doing the drop-in coordinator thing because you knew the ropes because you'd been hanging out there?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
And how many people would come to was the drop-in like every day?
Yep.
For all day or just a?
No, closed. There were. Ooh, when did it? We were having to lock up, so it must have closed between probably midnight or 11 or something, and 9. I don't know. I'm just guessing. It wasn't open 24 hours.
I think maybe it was at the beginning. I've seen
24 hours, really?
Well, I think so, but I don't know for sure. I mean, at the beginning it was a house that had the drop-in center in it, so that
Oh,
might
yeah.
have, maybe people lived in the same, I think maybe they did live in the same house.
that
or
was
lived.
before my time.
Yeah, but it was still, that's a long day for it to be open, and then, so at any one time, do you have any idea how many people would have been, do you have any recollection?
How many people would be there?
Yeah.
Well, it really varied, but there could be, I mean, if there was a meeting or something, there'd be upwards of 100. On a normal, everyday night, I don't know, maybe anywhere between 20 and 40, maybe 50.
Did you serve food there?
Not on a regular basis. I seem to recall there might have been occasions when there was food, but that was rare.
And
Wasn't part of the program or anything.
And the woodworking shop, was that at the drop-in as well?
I guess it would have been. I don't remember there being one.
Oh, okay.
But
No,
there was a
because-
separate space for like a multi-purpose arts room, and I guess if there was woodworking going on, that's where it would have been.
they did have a woodworking program, but I don't know when it stopped. But they actually made, I mean, when we were interviewing Patty, she says, oh, that cutting board over there was made in the MPA. And the office downtown on Powell Street has one of the tables that they made for the drop-in
Oh,
center.
really?
Still one
I
left.
don't recall that. It might have been before my time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, woodworking, that would be expensive to run.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe that was, because there's a reference in Head into the 80s to cutbacks.
Mm-hmm.
So you must have been there in that era, because I remember, that has been an era of cutbacks, like the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that impact of cutbacks within the MPA?
I don't really, because actually it seemed to me one of the last things that I was involved in was a bit of an expansion in that the Phoenix apartment building was being built, and I was helping coordinate the planning for that. So I must have been just leaving as the cutbacks were really being felt, maybe.
Can you tell me about being a residence coordinator? Because we haven't talked to anyone who, we haven't actually talked to anyone who lived in a residence, which is a bit of a gap.
Right. Well, yeah, there were generally, I don't know, maybe depending on the size of the house, anywhere from 6 to 10 people living in each residence, and the members of the household would vote in the people that they wanted to have live there. So they kind of interview people who are prospective residents. They elected their coordinators as well, it's already stated. There'd be a weekly meeting. I think we had our meetings on a Monday, where we'd map out who was responsible for cooking and cleaning, and somebody would be designated, to shop. I'm not sure how the money for that happened, was collected, or where it came from. But anyways, so yeah, all the chores were divided up. We were, available to people. I guess we made an appearance as coordinators probably every day, but maybe not necessarily. But would be available to people if there were, any problems came up, to go over and help deal with them. Don't really remember much about repercussions or if people didn't follow through with their chores. Don't remember how that was dealt with, but I imagine, there would be, that would be dealt with in a meeting as well, and if the transgression was serious enough, a separate meeting would be called.
So if a person wanted to move into that house, they would go through kind of the central MPA.
No, just, I think, my recollection is they would just come to the residence and meet the people, probably at the regularly scheduled weekly meeting, and to meet the people and get a sense of how the household worked and what the expectations were. And the current residents would, I think, ask them questions or kind of interview them informally, and then would vote on whether they thought that person would be a good fit. And if they were, then good. I guess the person was free to go to other residences if they weren't perceived as a good fit for the one in question.
I don't know if you can answer this, but did different residents, like I would sense then that different residences would have quite different characters in a sense.
Yeah, they did. And that was always in flux, of course. I don't know what the average stay was, but some people were there for, substantial periods of time, and there would often develop a kind of a core group that would, and also the characters of the coordinators kind of contributed at least to the overall character of the house. So they'd each, and that could be they could be really stable and good for a while, and then it could, a few people change, and it could get kind of weird and difficult to deal with for a period. So that each house was kind of on this, roller coaster as well. It did vary, between the houses, and even changed within each house.
I can't imagine that, like I've got to check to see with the MPA whether that's still, I think a vestige of that still happens, but the notion of a person going around and being interviewed by the other residents is so participatory democracy, right? That I'm curious to know if that's still that still exists, you know.
Yeah, it would be too, actually.
Really, that's giving people a lot of choice over their living situation. It must have been phenomenal for self-esteem.
Yeah, I mean, my recollection is that it was great for the vast majority of people. I mean, there would be people that, like a co-op situation, didn't really understand what they were getting to, or, it just didn't work out, but it was incredible for, the vast majority of residents. Very good situation, stable and respectful, and, good, yeah, good for their self-esteem, as you say.
So, did they do their own cooking?
Yep, that would be something that I would say generally the coordinators would help a lot with, teaching people, reteaching people how to do that kind of stuff, how to cook.
You mean reteaching people?
Well, not everybody, but people that were, had never learned that, or were institutionalized, or whatever, just to introduce some variety into their diets, because people would tend to want to subsist on, macaroni and carbs or whatever, so try to, introduce some healthy eating habits.
Yeah, because you were dealing with people who might have been have been institutionalized for quite a period of time.
Some of them, yeah. Because some of them, would have been older. I recall that the residents at the house that I was working at for that time, at least, were fairly young. But and that's probably another household character. I expect that there were probably other houses that tended to have, or might have at the time had, older residents who, as you say, could have been quite institutionalized.
Yeah. And then the house that you were coordinator for, was that was a kid's house too?
It was on McDonald. I think it was called the West 7th House, and it was on McDonald and 7th.
So I'm wondering if the houses, because I think they eventually had houses in on the east side and other places, and that maybe a kid's house might have been different too. Like the neighborhood might have influenced the nature of different houses.
I don't know. I tend not to think so much, because there wasn't a lot of interaction that I was aware of with the neighbors.
Right. Oh, okay. That's interesting. Negative or positive interaction.
Yeah. Not that I was aware of, or that I would expect. I guess maybe for fear of, negative. I think there might be a tendency to be kind of insular, just so that to head off any prejudices at the past, and just, quietly go about their business and hope that there aren't any neighbors that would have a problem with it.
Were there ever any kids?
Not in my experience.
Yeah. And kids at the drop-in?
Rarely. No, I don't think. I don't remember there being any kids.
So Geoff, were you around when the NFB film was being made then? If you were around, because in '77 was when the NFB film was made.
It was made when?
77? Maybe 76, like it was released in 77, so maybe they were filming the year before.
Yeah, I guess I must have been, because I think, the guy, Rick Patton, did he make
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was around. Don't think I was in it somehow, but I was around. I think I vaguely remember.
They don't have many names. Patty's name is mentioned, and Randy Dowling, and then Lanny Beckman was interviewed. Though, I think he was kind of out of, like, he said that he really left in 75, 74, 75, yeah.
Huh. interview with the psychiatrist whose hand was hanging there and it looked like a claw.
In the film?
Yeah, in the film.
I'm gonna have to look at it
He
again
was,
then.
I think it was when he was it the guy with the Scottish accent? I can't remember. It was just, everybody laughed when the camera just zeroed in on his hand. Anyways. Yeah, I'd forgotten there was a film, actually.
Well, there's a film, and then what I actually like better as a piece is an earlier CBC documentary piece that we just got a copy of. I just got a copy of, but it's like an much earlier in the 70s, and it's much more nicely filmed in my opinion. But you see, again, I think that people had good connections there, right?
Yeah.
You know, like somebody told NFB about the MPA, and that's, you know, somebody sold NFB on doing a documentary about MPA, and I find that interesting. And, you know, like the connections with writers at The Sun, Marilyn's then husband Bob, Bob Hunter earlier, and connections with the NDP. People in MPA, not necessarily everybody, but there were some people in the MPA that were that knew how to make connections, and that probably made a big
Well, it's a pretty
difference.
juicy subject for any filmmaker, really. So it probably didn't take much arm twisting at the NFB. I wonder who the producer on that was. I have some more recent, actually my current coworker was with the NFB Western region for a long time. It wouldn't have been that long ago, I guess, but.
I can't remember who do we have it in the car, or did I?
I don't know.
It's somewhere in the trunk. The rental car is like this
I can
office
look it up online.
with junk.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can find it online.
Yeah.
I ordered a copy, but it's just going to take a while for them to produce a
Is that-
DVD. I've got the video,
Oh, right.
but not the DVD,
Mm-hmm.
because that's I don't know, it's more tricky for them to. Yeah. In fact, if you bear with me, I might even try, because I have a feeling that those were sort of the last pages of, if this is in any sort of order, this endless finding aid. Yeah, because they reported a lot about the filming, because that was a pretty exciting thing for the In a Nutshell to have a film made about it.
So there's an archive of the In a Nutshell somewhere?
Well, we found the whole run, or the run to 1983 at the Vancouver Public Library in a bound form. The NFB has, the MPA has copies of In a Nutshell that somebody gave to them. Somebody told me, oh yeah, I gave them. I'm not going to be able to find this. But they have no institutional records besides them. They've got a bunch of slides, which all seem to come from the 80s. Oh gee, I wonder if you were in any of those, where everybody kind of looks like my brothers. You know, kind of like that hair, the mustache, you know, the clothes. But I suppose because they weren't that kind of organization to collect records, you know. So, but I have found, when I've been doing this, I found some early records that I think people have stuff, or not, or they just chucked it at certain points. But the organization itself has apparently nothing, which kind of amazed me. You know, because it's still in existence. It's now called the Motivation, Power, and Achievement Society.
When did that happen?
When did that happen? Not that many years ago. Yeah. So there's I think it's probably more identified with a kind of recovery model, or what do they call it? Psychosocial rehabilitation. Yeah. So it's an organized. I don't think it celebrates madness particularly anymore. If it ever, maybe it always probably had to kind of mute. Sorry, I'm not going to find anything about the NFB, because I'm flicking through here, and I know that they covered it, but there's just too many too many pages to this
Right.
finding aid. Yeah, so, yeah, but it was neat, the research that happened and their outreach. They used to go out and talk to people at UBC and talk to somebody we interviewed talked about going out to talk to high school students and mental health. And, you know, a number of people spoke quite, you know, about how it gave, I think community comes up as a keyword, self-esteem, and just how successful it was at housing and sort of more social stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Just recalling, we used to go to, we used to have a little kind of satellite office out at Riverview.
The,
There
oh,
were regular trips out there too.
there's Pennington Hall out at Riverview, but there's a Riverview extension that I don't really understand what it was at this point. Used to go to Riverview, what for? To work with people who are in Riverview.
I guess, yeah, to
Somebody else talked about that. Do you remember that? No.
just remember going out there. I don't remember, I can't visualize the space or what happened there. Maybe it didn't last very long, I don't know. But I would have, yeah, I would have thought it would be like outreach to current patients and maybe, you know, giving them some options around.
Yeah, did anyone come directly from Riverview to the housing?
I think there were some
Yeah.
that did. Don't really know.
And did you work at all with the Community Mental Health Center in Kitts?
Is that what was referred to as care teams?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, myself, no, but I know that a certain number of the people that were there were seeing care teams, and some weren't. So that was part of the whole medication thing, and debate and medicalization. Some people just didn't want to deal with care teams, while some found them really helpful and supportive. And different, my recollection is that different care teams had kind of different, or maybe individuals in the care teams had different reputations for around, whether they were any good or very helpful.
But your role as residence coordinator, drop-in coordinator, wasn't to do any kind of facilitation with the care teams then?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, see, that's interesting, because then you weren't part of a medical model. You were just helping support them in the community. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect. How are we doing?
We'll have to change the tape in 3 minutes.
No pressure, Jeff, that you got anything.
3 minutes to say something amazing?
But was it fun? I guess I just
Yeah, I mean,
it was
I remember
meaningful, but
yeah. Well, at times it really, I can remember just about tearing my hair out in confrontation with somebody at the drop-in. But on the other hand, incredible fun and just, I don't know how to describe that. This feeling of profound humanity that I experience anyways when something creatively beautiful happens, or not necessarily beautiful as in pretty, but something amazing happens. It really, it was a roller coaster. It had its ups and downs, but an incredible experience overall for me.
Yeah.
All right.
Good. That was that just sounds like really good. It is really interesting how, you know, how it coincided with your personal life in terms
Yeah,
of
it
your
was.
disability. You know,
Yeah.
because I would think that it gave your involvement with the MPA. I mean, obviously it was helpful when you came out of rehab, but that it must have given you some tools for dealing with that situation in which you found yourself, right?
Yeah, I would think it did. And yeah, just a whole philosophical foundation to deal with my new life. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was good. Good
Yeah.
training. Would be for anybody, but for me particularly.
Yeah. That's cool. So the Lethbridge connection's very interesting.